Thank you very much for coming to today's session. I think irrespective of the case, there's a lot I think I've got to, in terms of the message. So there's a lot which I'm going to get across to you. So in terms of the topic, I think my aim will be to round it up under an hour, hopefully 45. Well, I'll aim for about 45, 50 minutes. As we've got on the title, what I've got is Project Manager and Practitioner Heterogeneity on Congruent Perceptions of Project Outcomes. Now, to somebody who is not aware of the work I'm doing, the title almost appears completely meaningless, but one should not worry. What I intend to do is to actually take you through what this is really about. So I'll just start, for those of you who don't know me, just to tell you a little bit about myself. So I've been a professor of project management here at Buick since about last year. And prior to that, I held academic appointments at the University of Johannesburg, and before that, the University of the Witwatersrand, both in South Africa, and I'd originally come from the UK. So I'd held academic appointments at the University of Northumbria, and also at the University of Southampton, okay, in the UK. So that's kind of my academic background. In terms of qualifications, basic thing, I've got a couple of doctorate degrees, one in business, which I obtained this year at the University of Hull, and 10 years ago, I had my first doctorate in project management at the University of Northumbria. Okay, so that's literally about me, kind of a typical box standard academic bookworm kind of profile. Now, before I begin to tell you about this idea or this thing about congruence, perceptions, and stuff like that, what I'm going to do is to tell you a story so you can basically just follow where the idea has come from and what it's about. Now, let's basically start from the notion of projects and project management. Now, the theory does tell us that basically, in terms of business, the way forward for business is basically through projects. It doesn't mean, as in terms of a debate I had with somebody today, that projects are necessarily business. But those things that projects try to do, the theory tells us are best achieved using projects. Yeah, the concept of projects or project management. So projects are basically what it is, what the literature tells us, yeah? Non-repetitive acts, they're unique, time set, so they have a definite start, a definite finish. They're measurable, either quantitatively, qualitatively, or using the same, or using both measures. The basic thing we know in terms of the relationship between projects and business is that projects are the way, it is the methodology employed when one is considering their strategy, okay, for their business. And that's basically it. Okay, for businesses, you use projects to deliver strategy, okay? There is, however, a kind of a challenge when you start dealing with chaps like this. Because what you would see in this terms of this particular gentleman is that you may say, and this is quite serious, yeah? You don't really know. Do you really know what he wants? You wouldn't know exactly what he wants. So in this particular case, it's like some of those cartoon movies which you watch. And you're talking, or somebody is talking, or there's a big boss, usually all those mafiosi cartoons, and he says, yeah, talk to my cat, or talk to my dog, yeah? And it's the kind of the same thing. And that's why I've got this picture, because you don't really know, first of all, what he or she really wants or needs, and you don't know critically, this is where the issue of heterogeneity and congruence begins to come in, from whose perspective. Is it from his perspective, or is it from, would I say, its perspective? Yeah? And this is what today's lecture is all about. Now, let's think about what we know about projects today. I've made reference to Sing and Sing 2002. I understand the literature is a little bit still dated. But they tell us, Sing and Sing tell us that today's project environment is really chaotic. It's likely to be constituted of a variety of project stakeholders. So what you're going to have on a typical project is more than one person. Now, we usually go away kind of when we think about or when we consider what I may refer to as normative project management theory. We tell ourselves that there's one client, and that's the only person we need to deal with. At least that's what we tell undergraduate students. But sometimes that's not necessarily the case, even when you've got this gentleman. Okay? So this is basically what this notion of heterogeneity and congruence is all about. And that's why I've said, what is the implications for heterogeneity, which I haven't told you what it is. I will later, not now. And the idea of congruence, what's really going on. Before I begin to tell you what I think it is and what is going on and the research I've been doing, let's look at projects and the context of projects. The literature tells us that projects is derived from a Latin word, projicio, if that's the right pronunciation, to throw forward, yeah, to advance, suggesting a form of a movement, a trajectory, a certain relationship with time and space. So it is in the future. You are moving forward. It is a planned undertaking, which means that sometimes things can go wrong, yeah? Okay, it has a beginning, a definite beginning, and an end. And as I've said, there are other measures as well, yeah, which I've talked about. So this, at least, I hope, allows us to be very clear what a project is. So 2 or 3 major things at the moment. One is that we know what a project is, or projects are. We understand that the project environment is quite chaotic. We understand that what we used to be told in our undergraduate days, that we simply had to worry about the client, may not necessarily be true, because in projects you will have a range of stakeholders. And that comes with increased, as you can imagine, confusion. You've got to satisfy a lot of different people. Yeah? So I've told you what projects are, the challenges in terms of projects. Now, just again as part of this recap, I'd like to tell you very quickly, or talk to you very quickly about project management. This is this technique called project management. And as I've said, very much as the wedding planner, or would I say the arbiter, this person who is trying to stop this conflict. The whole idea in terms of project management is to coordinate activities, to get people to begin to do things in a coordinated manner. The reason is you're trying to avoid conflict and, you always trust that technology is going to go a bit wonky. The slides have stopped. Yeah, there are quite a few pictures. Let's see if no, it's just stopped. Let me see if it's going to move. Did something happen? Okay, so yeah, okay, so I got it back to move. So the whole idea in terms of what project management is trying to do is to reduce conflict and ensure that we generally maintain some form of similar, allied, generally accepted perspective of the project. So it's quite a simple and straightforward thing in a way. Yeah? You've got this entity. There's a start, there's a finish. Yeah? There's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of interest. And crucially, you've got a lot of different stakeholders who all have different interests. And in this mix, you've got the challenge to deliver. Yeah? At a very basic level to time, cost, and quality. But you need something, a kind of a technique, an approach, to ensure that everybody is moving in the same direction. So you call upon project management. That's where we are as of now. I guess I could have told you that in 3 minutes. Yeah? But that's basically what this whole thing is about. So maintaining those kind of shared perspectives ensures that basically, and this is where I think, I always use this particular slide. It ensures that we minimize confusion. Now, those of you in the back may not necessarily see this, but this is a kind of a typical picture showing, suggesting, articulating, whatever you want to say, how confusion over the maintenance of different perspectives may actually emerge in terms of your project. Can you see it? Yeah, okay. So some of you, most of you have seen this. I think you've probably seen this before. Okay, so this is what project management is trying to avoid. I know I still haven't told you what congruence and stuff is all about. So that's why I said, okay, you know what, just hang on, I will. So we often tell people that this is what project management is about. We tell them that project management is about delivering to time, cost, quality. And when you talk to people, especially people who don't necessarily have experience or who have not readily, or would I say extensively studied project management, this is always what they will remember. But the question is it really this? Is it really an iron triangle? Is it? Doesn't matter even if you put all of them in. The perspective is that that's not necessarily the case. And I will explain in a few minutes. That's why I said, do these measures reflect the modern project? And my position is that it doesn't. Even when you talk about scope and other stuff. And I'll give you kind of examples. So let's talk about some real life examples. The International Space Station. Planned initial cost. This is the estimated information gleaned from the internet. So I'm not sure if it's down absolutely correct, but the information seems to suggest that the initial plans for that particular project was about $8 billion US. It's telling us that it's 26 billion. That's the final cost. The question I've got, is it a failure? Is it a success? When you think about the so-called iron triangle.
Depends on the client. What did he change in the middle? Maybe he demanded some things that cost more money. Maybe he approved this change of money.
Okay, I'll use something else to talk about that. Let's forget the Channel Tunnel. Some of you may not necessarily know where it is or have used it. Doesn't really matter, but we all know the Burj Khalifa, okay? Okay, so think about this very carefully. Don't give me an official answer. Planned cost, 876 million. Final cost, 1.5 billion. Success or failure? Okay, that's one perspective. But, say again?
I believe it's not a failure.
You don't think it's a failure, why?
Because it depends on a lot of other aspects, like the contract, maybe things and items in the contract point that things, material, we will increase the prices. Maybe the school will be changed if this happened, if that happened, maybe.
It's not even that. It's not even that. I'll give you another example. The 2010 World Cup. A few weeks before the World Cup, the press were warning. The 2010 World Cup was the first World Cup held on the African continent. It was hosted by South Africa. And a few weeks before the 2010 World Cup, the press, especially the European press, were warning, oops, it's happened again, that fans were going to be taking their own lives in their hands if they went to South Africa. The Daily Star, a popular kind of junk kind of mail, warned that there was going to be a machete race war on the streets of South Africa. FIFA seriously began to consider a plan B. Yeah? That is, what are they going to do? Either to cancel it, move it to an alternative country. Yeah? The whole hoo-ha. But at the end of that project, or that whatever, South Africa became the plan B for all future tournaments in Africa. And certainly when the troubles in Libya started in 2013, South Africa became the place where they had to host it. And since then, there's been a host of other things happening in terms of the choice of South Africa, including the latest, which I think was about last week, when it was announced that the 2020, if I'm correct, Commonwealth Games was going to be hosted by South Africa. Now, the reality, however, and I don't have the figures here, but I can tell you that when you look at the cost in terms of how much South Africa spent, and the debate and the concerns that were raised by, or in social media, by civil society, why should the country be spending whatever billions of rand it spent to host the World Cup against investment in infrastructure? I mean, if any of you been to South Africa before, it's a poor and rich country. You literally see wealth living side by side with extreme poverty. And there were questions by civil society, why should the country be doing that? The amount of money it was spending could have been invested in other things. But when you look at the World Cup from a different perspective, you will actually see that, hey, actually, if you forget this time, cost, and quality, and, for example, make assessments based on social impact, even something as basic as image, the image of the country greatly improved. Remember, this was a country that for more than 50 years had literally been shut out of the world community during the apartheid era. So all I'm just trying to bring to you is you begin to see that success and failure are kind of, there's a very gray area between success and failure. Now, let me tell you, which is not in this slide, a kind of a very weird story. Now, this is true. It sounds really weird and stupid, but it's true. Some years ago, the Nigerian government spent, I think the press had it about $13 million US on a space program. So they co-opted the Chinese, do whatever to get a satellite or whatever into orbit, which they did, but then the spacecraft got lost. It disappeared. It went up and then just didn't come back till today. The reality is that the Nigerian government did not, or at least the people in charge of that project, claimed in the Nigerian Senate that it wasn't a loss. That actually, hey, we've managed to do this. Yeah? We became the first African country to actually get something out there into orbit. So all I'm just trying to say is that failure and success is not as black and white as the so-called iron triangle tries to pretend it is. Yeah? And it's something that you've got to, to understand. More specific examples, in 2005, the United States Navy spent about $1 billion on an ERP system that was never used, but suggested that it was not a failed project, especially as valuable information had been gained from basically the failed implementation. I would say that's a lot of money to learn from a mistake, but it was justified. We've got other projects, the Millennium Dome. Over a period of time, there was that debate whether it was a failure. So suddenly what you find is that success and failure is not a kind of a static concept, yeah? It's time dependent. Do you get what I'm trying to say?
I get that it will depend on the aim of the project, on the results that will come from the project.
Why don't we just say it will depend on the context of time, which can literally be changing on a daily basis? Yeah? Because the aim of that project could literally change, obviously depending on the political imperative.
Okay, I mean, like for example,
Sorry.
For example, Bush Khalifa, the difference that like 2 times before the cost was doubled. But as the aim of the tower itself is to be the highest or the tallest building in the world, it's not too much.
Well, hang on. I can turn around and say to you, that's a lot of money for height.
Yes, but it makes a lot of money in the tourism and the repetition and a lot of...
That's right. So you begin to think about other things like image of the country. Fact of the matter is that it's an engineering marvel. Yeah? Not just that it's been built, but that it's been built and it's standing there. Yeah? So all sorts of things. So I think at this stage, the important thing to note is that success and failure of projects is not a very kind of clear-cut thing. It's a very gray topic, or would I say issue. It's dependent on a lot of factors, which could easily change the next day. Yeah? So that's one thing to take away. So I'm just going to breeze over. This is kind of book standard stuff about how the issues in terms of the Millennium Dome, literally over a period of about, I think, 5-6 years, continue to change. So it's not really important. But I think what I've said, or what I would like to say here, is that what I've tried to do at this point, and I do know that I have still not told you what heterogeneity is or what congruence is. I haven't. I will, okay? But what I've been trying to do is to build up the story. So, the notion of heterogeneity and congruence within this idea of a very fluid, can we take that? Just say a very fluid notion of success and failure is based on this premise that specific parameters, and this is kind of the research I've been doing, primarily, I'm not saying only, but in terms of the work I've been doing, the research I've been doing, these 2 parameters, demography and culture, influence how we perceive things within our projects. Now, when I'm talking about demography, I'm talking about age, gender, religious background, the job you do, that kind of stuff, yeah? The basic demographical issues, race, etc., etc. And then culture. So your predominant culture. But also things relating to the concept of cultural intelligence and cultural exposure. In effect, Mr. AB, who has lived all his life in country A, will not necessarily see things the same way with Mr. X, who has lived in the 5 different countries over the last 9 years. Yeah? Cultural exposure and cultural intelligence. Yeah? So the more you kind of are culturalized, become familiar with other people's culture, your perspectives begin to change. Yeah? You stop seeing things from one perspective. Yeah? That's basically what I'm trying to say here. So it's kind of a little bit funny that I said, you know, it's like if you and I look at this particular, at that microwave, yeah? So if I ask the question, what do you think that they see? Well, I don't know what they see. I've, not spoken to them. But I suspect what they see there is slightly different from what you and I see. Yeah? So what we see is slightly different. But I've got other examples. There's the typical, is this glass half full or half empty kind of thing, which some people believe that depending on your cultural disposition and also depending on your age, gender, etc., something has happened. Yeah, it's gone offline and this guy is not around. It's plugged in. I thought that's what IT does. It wasn't plugged in. Oh dear. It's fine, I'll just restart it again. They'll just have to cut that bit off. I don't know why the guy's disappeared. Sorry, just give us a second. Did it come back up? Yeah. Okay. So where was I again? Yeah, so what I was just trying to say is that there's the typical, is the glass half empty, half full, which a lot of people talk about when they look at cultural dispositions and other things as well. But what you will find in the literature is suggestions that demographic and culture impacts on basically your perceptions of stuff, yeah? Ranging from a whole set of topics, your ethical disposition, for example, yeah? How you view things, whether your consideration in terms of whether a particular act is ethical or not. So all these things are influenced by demography, age, etc., and also one's cultural disposition, which is why I've put these in to kind of ask this question. Is it, typical thing is if you put this and ask your child, or you've got a little child around, and put that on top of that, and then ask the child, what have you seen? Yeah, they'll tell you they've seen a mouse on Mars. The same thing when I thought about apple in honey and stuff like that. It's an Apple phone, yeah, an iPhone and stuff like that. So I've talked about these issues, or I've talked about perceptions, culture, demography, stuff like that. Before I jump into this, I guess I'd like to see if you think you can guess what maybe UD is talking about when UD talks about heterogeneity and congruence. Do you want to take a guess what it could be? Sorry, I'll just go back there. Do you want to take a guess? No, not necessarily outcomes. Let's say heterogeneity.
Most powerful stakeholder is deciding this.
Not really. Well, no. Okay. Let me give it away. It's fine. Let me talk about heterogeneity, and you get to understand. So I'll talk about the first thing, heterogeneity. Projects are undertaken by teams of skilled managers and practitioners. Yeah. In addition to that, you're going to have a lot of stakeholders. Okay. All of these stakeholders are different. They're individual, whether people or organizations, yeah? They all have a range of interest. They all have and perceive things differently. It doesn't matter whether they're all organizations based within the UAE. They all have what they're interested in, how they measure progress, how they measure how they see things, yeah? And we say that heterogeneity represents those differences. Heterogeneous differences. So then I talk about work-related differences, yeah? And I give an example. Managers from different units of the same organization may have or exhibit differences. Typical thing, what happens in a university. Give a couple of professors an assignment to mark and second mark. They will almost inevitably come up with different marks. Even if they come up with the same marks, chances are the comments are going to be different. There may be some similarity, but there will also be some differences. So this is what we mean by heterogeneity. In effect, when we consider the outcomes of our projects, how does individual differences influence on those decisions, those assessments that this is a success or that is a failure, or vice versa? And that's one of the things my research has tried to do, is to understand how these well, it's not how they manifest, but literally to understand the existence of these differences. And that's heterogeneity. The other side of that, well, not quite, but aligned to that is what we've referred to as congruence. And it's very basic. It's basically, as I've said here, agreements, perceived relationships and agreements. So what basically is the story here is that in your project, you're going to have different people, different organizations, different stakeholders. Now, those differences mean what? That they're likely to see things differently. That's fine, but also it's important to understand whether they see similar things. Yeah? What similar things do they see? Yes? Yeah.
The main skeleton is going to be known by the most powerful stakeholder, like the director in the project, like the client or developer that have, or a project that have consultants, subcontractors, and contractors. It will draw, like, for example, the failure and success of the project will depend, for example, on the time. It should be finished on time. A lot of things can be changed or eliminated or added. The cost can be changed or varied. It's fine for them. But
no.
It will be like based on the skeleton that they.
Okay, let me take you a step back and articulate something. There's a tendency for us to think about power and power relationships in projects, to think about the notion of the all-powerful boss sat in a dark room somewhere stroking a cat, yeah, like in James Bond. But that's not necessarily the case in terms of projects. Go around, I'll tell you one interesting thing when you want to think about power. Go around buildings in Dubai, at least, let me be honest to say, in Silicon Oasis. There is something which, even in England, I don't see in a lot of public buildings, or attempts are made, but here it seems to be natural. And this is the disabled ramp. Yeah? At least in all most of the apartment blocks you come across in Silicon Oasis. I haven't really gone around to other areas in Dubai. You find that. Now, you wouldn't think automatically that disabled advocacy groups are powerful per se. Yeah? It doesn't give the notion of power. Yeah? The issue is there's a difference between the owner of a project and users. Yeah? That's one thing you've got to remember. Now, you could build anything you want and use it yourself. But if the case is that you want that particular project to be used or exploited by other people, for commercial reasons, for example, then you have to be all-encompassing. It's not just about what you want. It's about building things that you may not necessarily like, but you've got a clear understanding that other people want to have. Yeah? So I would say, don't think about that the most powerful person on the project may necessarily be the most influential. Fair enough, even if it's the person paying. But remember, and this is Dubai, that customers do what? They vote with their feet. Yeah? So if you're putting across products and services which people are not going to buy because you're designing those products and services to suit you, then people are not going to use it. So I think I would like you to walk away, to, or would I say step back a little, from the notion that it's the most powerful stakeholder. There are a range of stakeholders on a project. The idea is to be as all-encompassing as you can because you want maximum utilization. Yeah? It might also mean that sometimes you have to cater for things you just don't necessarily right. Like, I mean, we're in Dubai, yeah? If you go to Carrefour, sorry, I hope I don't offend you, but if you go to Carrefour, the supermarket, there's a section where they sell pork. Is that? That's right, but it's there. Now, you and I might not eat pork, but there are people that eat pork. But we understand that we want to cater for those people as well as customers of Carrefour's. So we have to, yeah, to kind of cater for their needs without necessarily saying that we like whatever. So I'm just using that. I couldn't think of any other example right now. Yeah? So it's not about the most powerful. Is that okay? Yeah, no, I don't. We're just having a chat. It's just, I'm just telling you, this is not a formal thing. I'm just telling you about the research I'm doing, yeah?
I get the idea.
Yeah.
Maybe when I said this, I was thinking about the main project I'm working in. It's a government project. It's emerging housing development.
But people are going to use it.
The problem there is the time. Like, time is assigned by the highest authority in the country. So when they say it could be finished on that time because it will be distributed on people, it should be finished on that time. They change a lot of things, cost increase, design increase, a lot of addition has been done with the equipment, with the ceramic, a lot of things inside the villa, outside the villa, but it has to finish on time.
I don't have a problem with that, but think about it this way. The people who move into that villa, when they move in, are they going to be complaining? Oh, I've just moved into my villa, but it's a bit late, isn't it? Would they you know, so, yeah, somebody's always going to set some form of arbitrary deadline and stuff like that, but it's an arbitrary thing, ultimately, yeah? I understand very clearly, we always in project management work backwards, yeah? We have a time that we have to meet, yeah? I understand that, okay. So I kind of talked about this notion of heterogeneity. I've talked about congruence, so hopefully got some kind of clarity in terms of what the two mean. So the question is, why is this important? I guess I'm trying to justify to you why I've been spending a lot of my time on this kind of research, yeah, so to speak. Well, there are a number of reasons. Now, I've got a lot of blah, blah, blah written here, but this is the basic thing. If I don't understand how you are likely to see something, it's going to impact upon our working relationships, isn't it? Yeah? So if I wore shorts and came into lectures, you might not like that. And certainly someone wouldn't like that in the back, would you? Yeah? So that's one of the things, is we try to ensure that we do not misunderstand people's expectation, that we have some kind of understanding of what a certain kind of clientele group would want. Yeah? So that's basically what I'm kind of, we basically get to understand decisions that other people other stakeholders in our projects are likely to make. That's basically why it's important. There is, however, a danger, a big danger, when you take this kind of study too far. And that danger, which is kind of a caution, is you begin to stereotype people. Oh, UD said, yeah, that people under the age of 25 years will always view projects as blah, blah, blah. And you've read it because you've read it somewhere while you're on a train, yeah? Or on the Dubai Metro. And then you begin to perceive all your clients or customers of a certain age, gender, race, religion, height, whatever it is that fancies you, to be likely to behave in a certain way, or to be likely to take XYZ type of decisions. And that is not what the purpose of this. So the purpose of my research has never been to stereotype people. Yeah? It's indicative, but it's not about stereotyping. And that's what I would always say I need to caution people upon. So there's other stuff here, but I think we can kind of jump over this. So on the next slide, just to give you kind of an example of why I think this is important. Most of you have heard about them. Yeah? You probably know where I'm going with this. The International Space Station, yeah? Think about a project as complicated as that with the number of, I think there are about 15 different European agencies directly involved in its funding, and there's the allied agencies who collaborate and stuff like that. So think about that kind of situation. And we talked about the International Space Station costing about 26 billion, not million, billion US dollars, I think in one of the earlier slides. So think about the political interest, the pressure, et cetera, that you're going to have on that kind of project. And then think about a situation where you've got constant misunderstanding simply because people don't see things the same way. Yeah? I wouldn't actually put it that way. In fact, sorry, let me retract that. Because people don't understand the likely decisions that their colleagues are going to arrive at. Yeah? Do you kind of get what I'm talking about here? Yeah? So when you think about and as I said here, you're talking about 15 different nations and countries in terms of direct funding, et cetera, plus the other allied organizations, university collaborations, the smaller countries who may just occasionally get somebody over to get somehow involved. So you think about that, and this is, to me, one of the biggest pictures, or the most important pictures. Now, while they are not necessarily, would I say, project managers, but it can show what can sometimes happen when there's misunderstanding of intentions, yeah? In terms of the sparks, either last year or 2 years ago, for example, between Barack Obama and Vladimir Putin. So that kind of scenario can manifest in very important projects, obviously at the detriment of project progress, yeah? Ultimately impacting on your customers, yeah? So that's why it's important, and to me that's always been the simple justification in all the series of studies I've done in this, and there are about 6 to date, publications on this, has been the simple thing in terms of the justification. It's important to understand, or at least get an appreciation of the likely decision judgments of other collaborators and stakeholders on your projects, without, remember what I've said, necessarily stereotyping them, yeah? And I said that is what fundamentally, ladies and gentlemen, my research has been about. That's literally what I've been doing. I'll tell you about how I started, and I think I'm just on the roundup now. So that's been the whole idea, and I'm just going to tell you how I got into this, yeah? This was the first, I'll tell you the story of this book. In 2009, so that was about 5 years ago, was it? Anyway, in 2009, I saw an advert, kind of like a call to papers that was made by the Project Management Institute. And it appeared, when I read it, that they actually, on an annual basis, put out this request for proposals for sponsored studies. So you write a proposal, and if your proposal is successful, then they will fund you to write or to do some research. So I saw the announcement, and I made an application. So I came up with this idea. And there were a number of personal things that had actually happened. Some personal funny things that I had thought about, or experiences that had made me begin to think about how, older people look at things in a different way than younger people, don't they? Our parents look at things differently. And I suddenly thought, hang on a second, what if I bring this idea to project management? And honestly, that was just what it was. So I got the money around 2010. Not that I got it in my bank account, I did not. What they will usually do is that they will pay the university that you're affiliated with, and the university would now use that to cover time so that you can spend time on doing the research. I'm a great believer in team playing. Majority, if not all, of my publications has always been done in teams. I love working in teams. So I set about going up, literally getting a map of the world and thinking, hang on a second, I'm in the UK. I need to get as much as possible people around the world to get involved in this, yeah? So I made contacts, never met them before, but I've been working with them ever since then. I made contacts with academics in Brazil, in China, in Nigeria, Thailand, UAE. As of that time, I wasn't here. The UK, the US. There were some other countries. Some people just didn't bite. Yeah, they never responded and stuff like that. So I think in my mind, I had a cutoff date. And by the cutoff date, I only could get academics from these countries. And I thought it was good enough, yeah, to actually proceed. So the initial team I started with was basically this. So there was myself, and initially at the time, the research, up to the time the research was, the last draft of the research was being presented, I was still based at the University of Southampton. But then later on, I think a day or two after submitting this, I moved to the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. There was my colleague, Max Chipulu, at the University of Southampton. Terry Williams was at Southampton and then moved to the University of Hull. Stuart Maguire at Sheffield. So these were the people in the UK. In the UAE, I had Paul Gardner, who is now at Schema Business School in France. In the US, I had a guy called Vital Anantamula from Western Carolina University. Caroline Mota in Brazil. I can't pronounce that place. If you can pronounce it, I'll give you a biscuit. There was a contact in China. In Nigeria, there was a guy called Peter Mwilo, who is now the Surveyor General of Nigeria, so it's gone up quite high. And Pin Supap in Thailand, the guy in Thailand. So these were the people I got together with. It was quite a very exciting time. Apart from a few of them, I didn't know them. But I contacted them and was able to, thanks to Skype, get these conference calls going to begin this kind of call in terms of getting this research project to go on. Literature-based inspiration was basically from the work of Hofstede, Gert Hofstede. So hello, there was no surprise of that. There's a lot of stuff in here, but basically the major work I had come across to give me that, what I say, theoretical impetus was Hofstede's work, which most of you are very aware of. And as of that time, I had a couple of objectives, which was to examine how culture may influence perception of project success and failure over the project life cycle. And the argument for this, I'll make this available to you, yeah? So the slides, is that, as I said, the notion of project success and project failure is not static. Remember, in terms of the story I told you, it actually moves over time, yeah? So the whole point at this, the whole point was to look to find out if these perceptions of project success and failure over the project life cycle will change. And then to understand the importance these project managers and project management practitioners will assign to those success and failure factors. This is basically how the data looked in terms of the number of interviews we did, pilot questionnaires, the number of questionnaires we had, and finally, this is the number of usable questionnaires, which is one of the reasons why when I talk to students and they say, oh, I got 50 questionnaires, I say, no, you haven't started, yeah? Because within that, I was able to get that number. But actually, in terms of later research I'm going to show you I've been doing, I've not really been going less than 2,000, yeah? And there are ways to do it, to actually get that data. Okay, just very quickly, in terms of that initial data, this is basically how the kind of where we got, would I say, data from. You can see as far as Australia, obviously that's Brazil. We even had respondents from Argentina, which is there, yeah? So it was kind of a good spread. Some of them were not statistically viable. You know, when you got 2 from Fiji, and you think, what are you going to do with 2 questionnaires 2 people in Fiji have responded to? But basically, this is kind of what we found. I'd like to just go somewhere and show you how it actually panned out. Basically, this is what we found. We found, for example, in terms of forming perceptions of project success, project failure, at these stages, and we didn't use the standard PMI or APM project life cycle, but we just cut them down into 4. We found that these countries, so for example, just talk about this one, that what you will find here is that at the commissioning stage of a project, project managers from Nigeria were most likely, that's basically what it tells you, yeah, to form a perception of whether that project had failed or not. So that's the kind of information we had. And there's other information here. I can see some of you are tired, so I'm going to try to zoom through this. So that's basically what I've reported here, and you can take that away. In terms of that initial study. To begin to wrap this up, I've talked about inconclusive conclusions, because by the time we reported this study in 2011, I think by the time it was published, it was not very conclusive, because to an extent, we hadn't drilled right down. We also had problems with the data sets. 669 or 665 looks a lot. But in terms of giving us a clear story or storyline, we found that the data wasn't, we probably needed more, okay? So based on that, and I'm just going to zoom over here, over the last few years, I've been engaged with roughly the same people. Sometimes we change, yeah? So the original 7 or 8 of us have not always been in these follow-up studies. I think that the usual suspects, if I have to say, or use that term, still remains myself and Max Chipulu, and most occasionally Terry Williams. So, sorry, go ahead. Yes, mate.
If this data was about one country or one part of the world, it would be enough. Maybe this is not accurate because it was spread
It's not, I think,
I mean, the data, the results would be more accurate. Better.
well, it depends compared to what. I mean, if you got 665 respondents from project managers in the United States, is it really reflective of how project managers perceive things in the United States? It might not necessarily be the case. I'll try to wrap up. I know you're, yeah. So just to mention, what you will see, and just to make it easy, I've got the papers here, is that over the years from 2014, roughly working with the same, so you will always see myself, Max Chipulu, most of the times Terry Williams, yeah? So you got that paper, I think it was, let me see if anybody changed. Probably, no, it was the same. So suddenly we had this lady join, Teta Stamanta. So she was here when we did this paper. She was here again, and then we had another guy join us, yeah? A guy called Alistair Marshall. He got involved in this particular paper when we did that. And then suddenly here, myself and Max dropped everybody else, because at this point, I wanted to drill down almost what you were saying in terms of one country, to now bring this idea to South Africa, which is what I did here. Again, we're talking about 707 from there. And then moving on, again, you can see, I think this was the one I had accepted and published about 3 months ago, looking at it from a different perspective, which is where I've actually got the title of today's presentation. But again, now we've had additional. So now we're dealing with 1,413 respondents. And the final study, which we've done, which now what we've done is to go to organizations where we were able to glean information from 2,040 project, organizations. But in this particular case, we began to say, hang on a second, it's not just what they're saying. Let's look at the adverts they place. We looked at job adverts for project managers to see what are they actually saying, to begin to get this idea. And this has just been accepted about 3 weeks ago. That's why I didn't have it here, because I don't have the publisher's copy. Okay? And ladies and gentlemen, that's just about it.